So how can we move teachers in this direction so that they become excellent evaluators of critical thinking within the everyday life of the classroom? And I think we have a problem here because the teachers cannot be good evaluators of critical thinking unless they themselves think critically. Now the question then arises, well, do they or don't they? And the data which we have collected so far in our research, and we have a study that's going to be coming out soon that was commissioned by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing in California, our data indicates that at the college level, the majority of professors are not clear about what critical thinking is. And if you're not clear about what it is, it's going to be very hard to explicitly aim at it. So this takes us to the question, how can we help inform teachers and professors about what critical thinking is? Now, of course, one possible way that we could do this is to circulate some tests in critical thinking that have been professionally done and have the teachers look at these tests and get a sense of the concepts that are inherent in these tests and do some thinking about how these concepts relate to their subject area and their goals and objectives. So we can do professional development, or we can at least circulate critical thinking tests so that those who are teaching would have some idea of what professionals who have worked on critical thinking have in mind. They could also take these tests and do some testing and get some information back. I would put it to you that all the critical thinking tests that are available that at least Bob has listed on a list that he has put forward have some value, that you can use these tests and you can get some useful information. But the information, again, has to be interpreted. And that interpretation requires an individual critical thinking, evaluative judgment in the context that the person is making that judgment. So even if we know what the test scores of our students are, we still need to know what does that translate into for us? What would be the most appropriate pedagogical follow-up of the fact that the students are scoring low on the deductive section of the test, or they're scoring low on a test determining sensitivity to relevance or something else? Because we would have to ask ourselves, well, how can we make them more sensitive to relevance with respect to the subject we're teaching, or what sort of assignments would engage them in deductive reasoning within the subject that we're talking about, and what would not be appropriate. My experience in terms of the area of logic is an important part of critical thinking, is that most of the logic courses I've seen do not, in my view, are not likely candidates for helping the students to be more logical outside the context of the class. That very often, the very thing that is being done in teaching logic makes it unlikely that there's going to be transfer to everyday context or to the context of other classes. So that it isn't simply a matter of understanding an important part of critical thinking theoretically. You also have to have pedagogical insight into how to contextualize that and bring that into a classroom. For example, many logic classes are formal logic classes, and in formal logic classes you end up mainly working with symbols and the manipulation of symbols, and the students soon lose any sense that these symbolic manipulations have anything to do with reading an editorial or making judgments about their romantic relationships or buying a product at the mall or anything else of that matter. And we know from the literature on transfer that if you want transfer, you have to teach for it. And I would say most logic classes are not really designed with transfer in mind. So what's my point here? It's important for faculty to begin to understand what are some of the dimensions of critical thinking, what are the standards of critical thinking, what is critical thinking, so they have a professionally defensible notion. But secondly, more important than their hearing about what these things are, they've got to practice it. They've got to do critical thinking. both critical thinking about their subject and hopefully be sensitive to the critical thinking they're doing in their everyday life, or the way in which the critical thinking they're doing in their subject has some relationship to other subjects. Because, again, the power of critical thinking is, at least as I see it, that it's intrinsically and powerfully transferable, but only if you transfer it. That is, only if you see the important connections necessary to make the transference. So let's suppose I'm concerned that students develop sensitivity to recognizing the assumptions they're making while they write, or while they speak, or the assumptions made in the textbook, or the assumptions made by their friends when they engage in this or that practice. Well, what are the components of this understanding? First, they have to understand theoretically what an assumption is, and then they have to recognize assumptions in somewhat different contexts in order to actually develop the notion of what an assumption is rather than just an assumption in mathematics. Because students could develop the ability to identify assumptions in problems in math and actually not have any more pronounced ability to recognize assumptions when they go shopping. So if the faculty member is actually using critical thinking in their daily life, therefore noticing assumptions they make as they proceed through their life, while they're teaching assumptions in their subject matter, they will sprinkle in a variety of assumptions that they make, and hopefully significant assumptions that bear on the quality of their life, so that the students can see that recognizing assumptions is important. And then there's the possibility that the students will get assumption in the way they need to. Namely, we do it in math, but we also do it in the other dimensions. And here's an example here, here's an example there, here's an example in this other domain. So the idea of bringing critical thinking into the classroom is sort of logically complex. Are faculty aware that most of them are not clear about critical thinking? Are they open to learning something about critical thinking, theoretically speaking? Are they going to be sufficiently motivated to pay more attention to their thinking in everyday life to generate the kinds of examples that are going to take the students out beyond the subject matter? And then are they going to do the kind of effective assessment in the context of teaching which enables them to make the judgments as to how to move the student along through the content at a pace where they can realistically internalize what we're talking about? Let me turn for a moment to textbooks on critical thinking for a moment. Because, of course, critical thinking textbooks are designed to provide a general format for teaching critical thinking. They have questions at the end of the chapter, which are supposedly their critical thinking test strategy, and the student is marched through. But usually, the quantity of technical terminology in the textbook renders it extremely implausible that the student could internalize the quantity of theoretical material that is there. To give you an example, not from a critical thinking textbook, but a social psychology textbook, I took the index and I counted up the technical terms in the index, and there was over 560 technical terms. Well, if I'm taking a 3-unit course and many other courses, and I've got other things happening in my life, and we're marching through this course at anything like the pace that is suggested by the chapters, then there is no chance in the world that I'm going to internalize 560 technical concepts. And so either this textbook was designed without the thought that it's important for the students to think their way through it, or the textbook author has just not done good critical thinking assessment about what is plausible as a reasonable goal within the context of a course. So you can try to move students through critical thinking at a pace that more or less guarantees that they won't learn it. And we tend, just in general, I think you would agree with me, we tend to give students too much content rather than too little content. Too much theory rather than too little theory. And this applies to critical thinking as well.